I hadn't really given thought about songs and Job, but I'm curious, are there any Job songs? After church, if you can think of any, I wish you would tell me. I cannot think of any Job songs. Turn in your Bibles to Job chapter 1. And hopefully tonight we're going to look Job chapters 1 through 3. But we've already looked at some things in Job 1, so this is just kind of quickly. And you remember the story of Job, how he lost it all and still maintained his integrity. And that's really in our discussion of the book of Job where we had come to, there about verse 13, where it begins the losses that he suffers. And we find, yes, it's a loss of everything. We find, for instance, there in verse 14, the oxen and the donkeys were stolen away by the Sabaeans and the servants were killed. You drop down to verse 16 and you find the fire of God came and burned up the sheep and the servants. You drop down to verse 17 and read about the Chaldeans had come and raided his servants, taking all the camels. So at this point, basically, his livestock are gone, and the servants, except for that servant who would come back and tell him the bad news. But the worst is really yet to come. So you get down in verse 18, and while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead." You know, at that point, the oxen and the donkeys and the sheep and the camels mean nothing. Not when you learn that your children are gone. And oh, by the way, as you read about the children in the first few verses of chapter 1, why, it seems that these are children he can be proud of, that he's close to, and that they are close to one another and love each other. A good family. And now he's lost them, not just one or two. Yesterday I was in a store coming out, greeted the lady there at the door, and wished her well. She said, "It won't be a good Christmas. I lost my daughter right before Thanksgiving." And then she said, "That's the second child I've lost." Her whole holidays, more than just holidays, isn't it? Overshadowed with the loss of a child. He loses them all. How do you react? Well, the devastation you're going to read in this book comes greatly from the loss of his family. Look in verse 20. Then Job arose and tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground. Now, as you would look back at other times of grief and heartache, this is how it's expressed sometimes. But then it says, and worshiped. And worshiped. I have an idea that most people in this world, thinking in terms of this kind of loss, would not think in terms of worship. Many, many years ago, dear family, son was killed in a hunting, I would tend to say, incident. You know, it shouldn't be an accident what you shoot. You better know what you're shooting at. Son had been killed in a hunting incident. The funeral was that Sunday afternoon. The family, as you can imagine, they were devastated. I was almost, maybe I shouldn't have been, almost surprised when about the time for worship began, they came through the doors, sat on the back row, left quickly, but they were in worship that morning. That afternoon they buried their son. That evening, about the time for worship began, they walked through those back doors, sat on the back row. After it was over, they left quickly. I don't know how much they were able to put their minds and hearts into worship. But that's where they were. And here Job, having lost it all, where do we find him? Worshiping. Kind of reminds me of David. David, you recall the son that he bore with Bathsheba. Well, she bore the son. Sick. And then died. And you read the same. And he worshiped. When heartache hits, when troubles come, and we could say this, no matter how bad it is, turn your heart towards God and worship God. I think he was best able to do this because this is the kind of man he was. Those who seldom come through those doors, sit among God's people, those who, if they're here, don't want to sing and refuse to sing, those who may be present sometimes only in body but not in their hearts, they might not find it so easy or desirable to worship when heartache comes. But the man close to God, worship is natural. And even in the midst of the trouble, he worships. Notice what it continues to say about him. Verse 21, and he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And then in verse 22, in all this Job did not sin. I'd like to think that for every person I've ever known that's had trouble come into their lives, that it could be said they did not sin. Some people's reaction to the trouble and the hurt is to sin. Not only did not sin, or charge God with wrong. Once again, us modern day folk, how many times is God blamed? No, Job was not in the blaming God business. He did not sin, did not charge God with wrong. Chapter 2, you read once again this, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. That you read in chapter 1, verse 6. And then you find in verse 3 similar words that you'd found in chapter 1. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? Now previously, Satan's like, well, you've put a hedge about him. You've made it to his profit and his good to be good. You let me take that hedge down. Let him suffer a little bit. Then see what Job really is. God allowed it, but said, now you don't touch him. And that's how we get to, he loses his donkeys and oxen and sheep and camel and children. But once again, God's, look at my faithful servant Job. He says he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. Then verse 4, Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, all that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you and your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life. So now, faithful Job, faithful through losing all he has and his family, is stricken with, and we read of sores, loathsome sores. Maybe you remember the word boils. And it's so bad, you just read, he takes a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. This is a miserable sight. And that's when his wife, oh, by the way, she's left behind. Verse 9, then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? And then you read this. In this, Job did not sin with his lips. I wish I'd say I'd never seen anybody sin with their lips, but I've seen people otherwise good have some trouble, and they let one fly. Or maybe they cursed man. Or maybe they wanted to blame God. Not Job. Not Job. Now you begin to read of these three friends who come. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And it's good to kind of commit those names to memory because you're going to read them again and again and again in this book. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And while later we can be critical of what they say, I think initially you'd have to, they meant well. They singled out amongst everyone else living at that time were the ones who came to see him. We have this kind of trouble. Who's going to come knocking at our door? And you know it says in verse 11, they came to show him sympathy and comfort him. Okay, later we may say, they didn't do so good. And sometimes we have wanted to comfort, offer sympathy, and maybe we didn't do so good. But I appreciate them coming, and I appreciate the purposes for which they came. Show sympathy and comfort. And just how bad is it, verse 12? When they saw him from the distance, they did not recognize him. That's how bad it was for Job. They didn't even recognize him. Then in verse 12, middle ways, and they raised their voices and wept. Romans 12:15. There's the rejoice with them that rejoice and weep with them that weep. And they are weeping with him who weeps. In verse 13, they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. No one spoke a word to him. They saw his sufferings were great. I know I've heard people critical before about, well, they just sat there 7 days, didn't say anything. I really wonder if they provided greater comfort sitting there with their mouths closed than they when they opened their mouths and felt compelled to speak. Because as you read the rest of the book, you find that much of what they said was not so comforting, not so helpful. You know, sometimes we may think, okay, How do I show I care? Sometimes it's just being there. But I want to know what to say. Sometimes it's not what you say. It's just the fact that you're there. But I want to say the right thing. I do too. I haven't always. And everybody's different, so what's right for one might not be so right for another. But if you're there, you're showing you care. Well, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, these three friends, they were there. They cared. They didn't just come and go. I know somebody might think, I don't want anybody to stay with me 7 days. But I think it's another indication of how much they cared. They didn't just come and go. They didn't rush on back to their lives. They didn't say, well, I'm here, but I can't stay. They were good friends and had very good intentions. Now I want to spend the rest of this time to begin to see the suffering Job is enduring. You see chapter 3, verse 1, and Job opened his mouth. You've got 2 chapters. Most of it is a description of Job, the angel Satan with God. God pointing out faithful Job, only for Satan to say, let me at him. Then his losses. His integrity, and then once again, the sons of God, or angels, Satan, and the Lord, and Lord's, look at Job. Look at Job. And Satan's, let me at him. Let me touch his body. And then you read of the grievous sores. Really? Job has not said so much. Just a couple of verses. Chapter 1, verses 21, 22. Chapter 3 is all Job. See what he has to say. By the way, just by way of kind of outline, chapter 3, verses 1 through 10, some might call it Job's curse. Chapter 3, verses 11 through 19, some probing questions. And then chapter 3, verses 20 through 26, the mystery of suffering. Chapter 3, verse 1, and Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, let the day perish on which I was born. Used to be able to go to Ukraine and go into some classes of school-age children. They're learning English, and the teachers want them to hear English from someone who speaks English every day, from an English-speaking country. And so one thing you'll do is field questions, and almost invariably these kind of 9 and 10-year-olds are going to say, what's your favorite holiday? What's your favorite holiday? Up until I was older, I didn't know how to answer that. Now I'd probably say Thanksgiving, because you have a little more time with family than Christmas seems kind of rushed. But you ask them, what's your favorite holiday? The majority would say, and they'd kind of do this with a big grin, my birthday. And I never thought in terms of my birthday being a holiday, but they consider it such. And just like people often make big deals of birthdays, they make big deals of birthdays. And for that child, this is their day, and they look forward to it. Now look how Job's considering his day of birth. Cursed the day of his birth. Again, 3 verse 3. Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night let thick darkness seize it. You know, everything he says about it is basically coming down to, I wish there had never been a day of my birth. It's as if this is the worst day there's ever been, the day I was born. And then the last part of verse 6, let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Like I said, for those Ukrainian children, their favorite holiday was their birthday. Most children in our country, they look forward to their birthday. It's special. Even as we are adults, when we like to hear the happy birthday, we might say we don't, but we do, don't we? Somebody just remembering you, and if that's all the words, that's great. But he said, let it not rejoice among the days of the earth. It's almost as if he says, I don't want to ever have another birthday party. There's nothing good with the idea that I was born that day. He says, let it not come into the number of the months. Then he continues, verse 7, behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up the Leviathan. By the way, Leviathan's found 5 times in the Old Testament. Think in terms of a very large creature that we don't know exactly what was. Verse 9, let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. So all of this, it's about the day of his birth. And I'll say this, I'm impressed with Job and his words. It's like he's taking the idea of, I hate the day I was born. And then, in figurative language, he expresses that over and over and over again, using various kinds of thoughts, and then various words. If it's me, it's kind of like, I hate the day I was born, I'd have to stop. But his ability to express himself was amazing. But all of this is saying, I curse the day I was born. Or you might put it this way, I wish I had never been born. That's how bad it was for him. Now look, beginning of verse 11. And by the way, look at verse 11. You have the first word is why. Verse 12, why. Verse 16, oh, why. Verse 20, why. Then verse 23, why? It's not so much why am I suffering and why has all this happened to me, but it's still kind of related to his being born. Only it's not just I hate the fact that I was born. Now it's why didn't I just go ahead and die that day? Look at verse 11. Why did I not die at birth? Come out from the womb and expire. Down in verse 16. Oh, why was I not as a hidden, stillborn child? Okay, if I had to be conceived, if I had to be born, why didn't I just die then? I'd rather done that than deal with what I've dealt with. Verse 12. Why did the knees receive me? Think in terms of the father bouncing his baby on his knees. Or the breast that I should nurse. So here he takes his feedings. For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept. Then I would have been at rest. It's kind of like if I just died. If I hadn't had my daddy bounce me on my knees, his knees, or my mother feed me, I would have died. I'd been, verse 14, like the kings and the councils of the earth, who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with the princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. You know, they die too. I'd have been with them. Verse 16, or why was I a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. Once again, he's looking at death like a blessing. There the prisoners are at ease together in death. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster in death. The small and the great are there in death. And the slave is free from his master. I wished I'd never been born, but if I had been, I wished I'd have died then. That's basically what you have for verses 1 through 19. By the way, in Jeremiah 20, verses 14 through 18, Jeremiah had some similar words about his birth, kind of wishing he had died. Verse 14, Jeremiah 20, verse 14. Listen, cursed be the day on which I was born. The day when my mother bore me, let it not be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought the news to my father, a son is born to you, making him very glad. Let that man be like the cities that the Lord overthrew without pity. Let him hear a cry in the morning and an alarm at noon, because he did not kill me in the womb. So my mother would have been my grave, and her womb forever great. Why did I come out from the womb to see toil and sorrow and spend my days in shame? You see, the suffering was so great, it led Job to wish he had never been born. If he had been born, then to quickly die. And Jeremiah seemingly would have rather died to see what he was seeing. I find it interesting, though. Neither considered suicide. Some people so troubled, they think the way out is suicide. I never get that impression from Job. Wished he had never been born. Wished at birth he'd have died. But he's never considering suicide. Now look at verse 20. And once again, the why. Why is light given to him who is in misery? Kind of like, why is their life given to this fellow that's so miserable? And life to the one who's bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not. In other words, why do we live? He says, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures. Who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave. You know, we want to die. We're given life. Why is that? Verse 23, why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. I wanted to get through this as quick as I could because I wanted to consider one more thing, and what we're going to look at here, very little time for, but I wanted to make mention of it. See, his why was, why did I just die when I was born? It's not so much that he asked, why is all this happening to me? And the book of Job really is not the answer to why do bad things happen to good people. But some of the reasons sometimes people have given over the years. One, I'll call it doctrine of retribution. And some would go to passages of Scripture to try to substantiate this. Listen to Isaiah 3, verses 10 and 11. Tell the righteous that it shall be well with them. Listen, the righteous, it shall be well with them. For they shall eat the fruit of their deeds. Woe to the wicked. It shall be ill with him, for what his hands have dealt out shall be done to him. You see, it sounds like righteous, they'll do well. The wicked, they'll suffer. Proverbs 12, verse 21. No ill befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. Once again, you do good and you get good. You do bad, you get bad. Job 4:7. Remember who that was innocent. And by the way, these are the words of Eliphaz. He said, remember, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? Now, there's a general rule, yes, of do good and be rewarded. But in life, not always. Bad things can happen to good people, and Job certainly is reminiscent of that. So be careful of the doctrine of retribution. Second, read one time where a person explained, well, these bad things, it's kind of like a beautiful tapestry, and if you could back away from the tapestry and see it like God sees it, and see it from an eternal perspective, you'd see the beauty of it. But on the other hand, if you go behind the tapestry and you look at each thread and loop, you might see that some are longer than others, some are shorter, some are knotted, some are beautiful in the way that they're tied off, and some not so much. And that's the way our life is. And all we see is our little thread and our little loop. We don't see the tapestry on the other side. Sounds good. Not an adequate answer. Sometimes people would say, well, these bad things, they happen for our own good. And kind of connected with this, sometimes you might hear people say everything happens for a purpose. Kind of this way, suffering comes to ennoble man, to purge his thoughts of pride and superficiality, to expand his horizon. The purpose of suffering is to repair that which is faulty in a man's personality. A contemporary teacher, he kind of gave this image. He said, if a man knew nothing of modern medicine and he were to walk into an operating room seeing the doctor make his incisions on the body, he might think these doctors were the worst kind of criminals, but he said, but the reality is they were cutting away the bad to make him better. Some people have given that explanation. Now, once again, I think it falls way short and isn't a good explanation. Sometimes you may hear something like this, well, God never sends on us more than we can bear. Now, they might get that idea from 1 Corinthians 10:13, but go back and read it tonight later on, and you'll see that's not exactly what God says. None of these explanations sometimes people give for why we suffer, they just don't measure up. They just don't work. I saw recently an article from House to House, Heart to Heart. I didn't see an author connected with the article, but it was kind of a why we suffer and why do we have troubles. And frankly, all of these are good things to keep in mind. One, it says, we are mortal and live in a disease and death environment. Got that? We are going to die, and we live in a world that has disease, so it's going to happen to us. The second, we are foolish and make bad decisions, self-inflicted pain, and yes, sometimes sufferings we bring on ourselves. A third is we are connected and injured by others' decisions. The man who gets in the car that's drunk and he hits the innocent, and that innocent loses his life. Yeah, because of somebody else's poor decision. Another reason given is we are vulnerable and suffer from man's inhumanity to man. You know, the man getting into the car, drunk driver, he really doesn't intend to hit someone. But yet man, sinful man, sometimes he is just mean towards others. And then a last reason was given is we are righteous, and darkness hates light. Sometimes men suffer because they're doing the right thing, because they're living the Christian life. Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. So that's Job 1 through 3 in a nutshell. And I hope what you remember is what happened to Job. Kind of man he was, what happened to him. And then chapter 3, it's all about the birthday and what happens when he was born. And he's so overcome with the grief and heartache and trouble, he wished he'd never been born. That's those 3 chapters. If we could assist you in your obedience tonight, if it's a matter that you've not yet become a Christian, we pray that you'd want to recognize Jesus is the only way. He died on the cross. Blood was shed. By God's grace, we can be saved. We must respond with faith, turning from our sin, to confess that faith, to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins. If we could assist you in baptism, or if there's a need for prayer,